My name is Bill Furbush. I'm a superintendent of schools here in Pelham. There's a lot of reasons that this came up. What is competency-based education? As you know, the Pelham School District is moving towards that, as is all of New Hampshire. And I don't think that that's quite clear in the line of questioning that I've gotten over the past few months. And so I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about what competency-based education is, what the pillars are of that, and what is the history of it? Why is Pelham moving that way? And I hope after tonight, the goal is that you understand this is not just a Pelham initiative. This is not just a Bill Furbush initiative. This is not just a couple of schools in New Hampshire. This is the whole state of New Hampshire is moving towards competency-based education. And the whole state of Maine went to what they call proficiency-based education. Other states are moving towards it as well. It's not just us. But I want to explain some of that history of how we got here. And so the goals really are to talk about competency-based education, a brief history. I'll try not to bore you too much. The pillars of competency-based education. Why is it that we might be changing some of the ways we grade or report out or change some of those assessments? What is the foundation and what is the educational beliefs behind those changes? And I really felt the need to help educate everyone around this. And oh, by the way, for those who are here, we are videotaping this so we can make it available to anyone and everyone after this. So just so you know, it is being videotaped. And then the structures for implementation and going forward. You may have heard of some of these committees that we're putting together, some of the things that are happening at the school level, some of the things that are happening at the district level. So I really want to share out there what is going on, how can we be involved in this process and stay informed, and how can schools continue to communicate what is happening. So, first off, I have a short video by Sir Ken Robinson, Changing Paradigms. And I use this as a base so you understand why are we changing our current model into the competency-based model. Well, first I have to explain a little bit about our current model because a lot of people don't understand our current model.
Every country on earth at the moment is reforming public education. There are two reasons for it. The first of them is economic. People are trying to work out how do we educate our children to take their place in the economies of the 21st century. How do we do that? Given that we can't anticipate what the economy will look like at the end of next week, as the recent turmoil is demonstrating. How do we do that? The second, though, is cultural. Every country on earth is trying to figure out how do we educate our children so they have a sense of cultural identity and so that we can pass on the cultural genes of our communities while being part of the process of globalization. How do we square that circle? The problem is they're trying to meet the future by doing what they did in the past. And on the way, they're alienating millions of kids who don't see any purpose in going to school. When we went to school, we were kept there with a story, which was if you worked hard and did well and got a college degree, you would have a job. Our kids don't believe that. And they're right not to, by the way. You're better having a degree than not, but it's not a guarantee anymore. And particularly not if the route to it marginalizes most of the things that you think are important about yourself. Some people say we have to raise standards as if this is a breakthrough. You know, like, really, yes, we should. Why would you lower them? You know, I mean, I haven't come across an argument that persuades me of lowering them. But raising them, of course we should raise them. The problem is that the current system of education was designed and conceived and structured for a different age. It was conceived in the intellectual culture of the Enlightenment and in the economic circumstances of the Industrial Revolution. Before the middle of the 19th century, there were no systems of public education. Not really. I mean, you could get educated by Jesuits, you know, if you had the money. But public education, paid for from taxation, compulsory to everybody and free at the point of delivery, that was a revolutionary idea. And many people objected to it. They said it's not possible for many street kids, working class children, to benefit from public education. They're incapable of learning to read and write, and why are we spending time on this? So there's also built into it a whole series of assumptions about social structure and capacity. It was driven by an economic imperative of the time, but running right through it was an intellectual model of the mind. which was essentially the Enlightenment view of intelligence. That real intelligence consists in the capacity for a certain type of deductive reasoning and a knowledge of the classics originally, what we come to think of as academic ability. And this is deep in the gene pool of public education, that there are really two types of people, academic and non-academic, smart people and non-smart people. And the consequence of that is that many brilliant people think they're not, because they've been judged against this particular view of the mind. So we have twin pillars, economic and intellectual. And my view is that this model has caused chaos in many people's lives. It's been great for some. There have been people who have benefited wonderfully from it. But most people have not. Instead, they suffer this. This is the modern epidemic, and it's as misplaced and it's as fictitious. This is the plague of ADHD. Now, this is a map of the incidence of ADHD in America, or prescriptions for ADHD. Don't mistake me here. I don't mean to say there is no such thing as attention deficit disorder. I'm not qualified to say if there is such a thing. I know that a great majority of psychologists and paediatricians think there is such a thing. But it's still a matter of debate. What I do know for a fact is it's not an epidemic. These kids are being medicated as routinely as we had our tonsils taken out. And on the same whimsical basis, and for the same reason, medical fashion. Our children are living in the most intensely stimulating period in the history of the earth. They're being besieged with information and calls for their attention from every platform, computers, from iPhones, from advertising holdings, from hundreds of television channels. And we're penalizing them now for getting distracted. From what? Boring stuff. At school, for the most part. It seems to me it's not a coincidence totally that the incidence of ADHD has risen in parallel with the growth of standardized testing. Now, these kids are being given Ritalin and Adderall and all manner of things, often quite dangerous drugs, to get them focused and calm them down. But according to this, attention deficit disorder increases as you travel east across the country. People start losing interest in Oklahoma. They can hardly think straight in Arkansas. And by the time they get to Washington, they've lost it completely. And there are separate reasons for that, I believe. It's a fictitious epidemic. If you think of it, the arts, and I don't say this exclusively of the arts, I think it's also true of science and of maths, but I say about the arts particularly because they are the victims of this mentality currently, particularly. The arts especially address the idea of aesthetic experience. An aesthetic experience is one in which your senses are operating at their peak, when you're present in the current moment, when you're resonating with the excitement of this thing that you're experiencing, when you are fully alive. An anesthetic is when you shut your senses off and deaden yourself to what's happening. And a lot of these drugs are that. We're getting our children through education by anesthetizing them. And I think we should be doing the exact opposite. We shouldn't be putting them asleep. We should be waking them up to what they have inside of themselves. But the model we have is this. I believe we have a system of education that is modeled on the interests of industrialism and in the image of it. I'll give you a couple of examples. Schools are still pretty much organized on factory lines, ringing bells, separate facilities, specialized into separate subjects. We still educate children by batches. We put them through the system by age group. Why do we do that? Why is there this assumption that the most important thing kids have in common is how old they are? It's like the most important thing about them is their date of manufacture. You know what I mean? Well, I know kids who are much better than other kids at the same age in different disciplines, or at different times of the day, or better in smaller groups than in large groups, or sometimes they want to be on their own. If you're interested in the model of learning, you don't start from this production line mentality. It's essentially about conformity, and increasingly it's about that as you look at the growth of standardized testing and standardized curricula. And it's about standardization. I believe we've got to go in the exact opposite direction. That's what I mean about changing the paradigm. There was a great study done recently of divergent thinking. Published a couple of years ago. Divergent thinking isn't the same thing as creativity. I define creativity as the process of having original ideas that have value. Divergent thinking isn't a synonym, but it's an essential capacity for creativity. It's the ability to see lots of possible answers to a question, lots of possible ways of interpreting a question, to think what Edward de Bono would probably call laterally, to think not just in linear or convergent ways, to see multiple answers, not one. So, I mean, there are tests for this. I mean, one kind of cod example would be people might be asked to say, how many uses can you think of for a paperclip? One of those routine questions. Most people might come up with 10 or 15. People who are good at this might come up with 200. And they do that by saying, well, could the paperclip be 200 foot tall and be made out of foam rubber? You know, like, does it have to be a paperclip as we know it, Jim? You know. Now, there are tests for this, and they gave them to 1,500 people. This is in a book called Breakpoint and Beyond. And on the protocol of the test, if you scored above a certain level, you'd be considered to be a genius at divergent thinking. Okay? So my question to you is, what percentage of the people tested, of the 1,500, scored at genius level for divergent thinking? Now, you need to know one more thing about them. These were kindergarten children. So what do you think? What percentage at genius level?
80.
80. 80, okay. 98%. Now, the thing about this was it was a longitudinal study. So they retested the same children 5 years later, age of 8 to 10. What do you think? 50? They retested them again 5 years later, ages 13 to 15. You can see a trend here, can't you? Now, this tells an interesting story, because you could have imagined it going the other way, couldn't you? You start off not being very good, but you get better as you get older. But this shows two things. One is we all have this capacity, and two, it mostly deteriorates. Now, a lot of things have happened to these kids as they've grown up. A lot. But one of the most important things that happened to them, I'm convinced, is that by now they've become educated. You know, they've spent 10 years at school being told there's one answer, it's at the back. And don't look. And don't copy, because that's cheating. I mean, outside schools, that's called collaboration, you know, but inside schools. Now, this isn't because teachers want it this way, it's just because it happens that way. It's because it's in the gene pool of education. We have to think differently about human capacity. We have to get over this old conception of academic, non-academic, abstract, theoretical, vocational, and see it for what it is, a myth. Secondly, we have to recognize that most great learning happens in groups, that collaboration is the stuff of growth. If we atomize people and separate them and judge them separately, we form a kind of disjunction between them and their natural learning environment. And thirdly, it's crucially about the culture of our institutions, the habits of the institution and the habitats that they occupy.
So, if you're interested, that's Sir Ken Robinson and Changing Paradigms, and it is really only an 11-minute video. But as you can see, you recognize some of the same structures, the gene pool of our thinking and around behind our current model. Our current model is called age-graded model, and it is over 250 years old. A very brief history of it is Horace Mann goes to Prussia, before Germany was even a country, and says, what are you doing for public education? Because it was revolutionary at the time. They had school, mandatory schooling, all the way up until what is equivalent of our 8th grade, paid for by taxation. That was revolutionary. It is also why we still have the word kindergarten in our model, because we literally, Horace Mann took that model and brought it here, started a couple of schools, and then it was just copied all over. And that is the age-graded model. Why do we call it the age-graded model? Because when you're 5, you start kindergarten. When you're 6, you go to 1st grade. When you're 7, you get the point? Our students are grouped by what factor? And what factor alone? Their age. So it's called the age-graded model. What happens when you have kindergartners who already come in reading? What happens when in the curriculum, the standards that are set for kindergarten says, well, we got to teach you the 26 letters, uppercase and lowercase. We got to teach you these 500 sight words. And that kindergarten teacher says, what do I do with you? What do I do with you when you're coming in? You're 5. This is what we say we have to teach all 5-year-olds, but you already know it. Or you're so far behind, and every educator in this room has seen students like this who can't identify a letter in their own name or a color when they start kindergarten. They're the same age, but they're in 2 very different places on day 1. On day 1. How do you think these students are their sophomore year in high school? Their junior year in high school, or later? It's built on 2 huge flaws, the age-graded model. 1, children do not learn all at the same pace. Every parent in this room knows that. I have 3 children of my own. Genetically, they're as close to being the same person as you can get as siblings. They were raised in the same household. But I can give you examples of their learning to read was very different, their learning to ride bikes was very different. They had the same resources, but they're all very different, and they all have their different strengths. How do you think an 8-year-old who shows up for math class may or may not be ready for what we say 8-year-olds need to learn on this day? What happens is they're already starting to build upon these gaps, because that teacher worked really hard to get through that curriculum that was based on time. 180-day curriculum. And they got through that curriculum as fast as they could and as hard as they could because they had principals telling them that they had to get through that curriculum. But it was based on time, not based on the students learning and demonstrated understanding. And that's another huge flaw. Children do not learn all at the same pace, and there's no such thing as a standard child. I've not met one 7th grader that has all the exact same standards as any other 7th grader. They don't exist. Yet our current model makes those assumptions. And those assumptions, each and every day, make it nearly impossible to teach them as effectively and as efficiently as we should be able to teach them. Because it's not personalized. It was, as you saw from Sir Ken Robinson, around a production line assembly. It's efficient. It gets kids through, but it's not the best way of educating his child or any person. What about my learning? What about what is right for me today? When you have that 7th grader showing up for fractions, it's not just about that 7th grade curriculum, it's about the 6th grade curriculum. And did they learn it? Or are we building upon gaps? Or did they learn the 5th grade curriculum? We don't know. Our current model just pushes them through with time. That's why you're seeing a massive change. New Hampshire believes we can create a better model, a more personalized and individualized to students. I'm going to show you one more video clip, and that's the last video clip. And this is Deputy Commissioner Paul Levin.
Since 2005, New Hampshire has required and expected competencies at the high school level in our high school courses. Now we're taking it really several new steps. We're going K through 12, so we're involving elementary and middle school in the competency effort. Actually, this has been requested of us from the field for a number of years. The feeling that to expect students to be involved in competency education at the high school level without having the preparation for it prior to that made it difficult. Secondly, we're really building the infrastructure to support competency education. So developing the technology, providing the professional supports for our teachers, and providing the assessment structures and grading structures so that we can support their learning over time. So it's really a transformation of our entire system to support personalized learning so that students can advance upon mastery.
He just recently retired, by the way, but he was credited with a lot of the work that went into it. And did you hear what he said? Since 2005, competencies have been in place in New Hampshire high schools. They were required in the minimum school standards to develop competency by mastery. And that was one of the first things that New Hampshire did. We're not going to go over all this. We're going to go over a lot of it, but it really started in 1997. New Hampshire wanted to stay on the cutting forefront. What can we do to make sure that our students are ready for the 21st century? They got 4 high schools to start looking at competency assessments. And they started to look at the Carnegie unit. The Carnegie unit is at 120 seat hours and how we used to get credit both in high schools and in colleges. Again, our whole determination of learning wasn't what you learned or what you demonstrated you learned, but did you do the time? And so New Hampshire actually was the first state to do away with the Carnegie unit. The 2003 competency assessments were then expanded to 27 high schools. New Hampshire DOE hosted a number of stakeholder workshops, forums, and focus groups throughout 2004 and early 2005 in response to the growing concern that New Hampshire high schools were not preparing their students for the success in 21st century. So in July of 2005, they used that input and they became the first state to abolish the Carnegie unit. And they said high schools have to come up with a better way to make sure that the students demonstrate their understanding rather than just checking off that they did their seat time. So New Hampshire mandated that all public high schools award credit in terms of mastery. You get where the terminology is coming in, and that's where competency. Are you competent in this course? How do we demonstrate that? So New Hampshire DOE modified the state education policy through regulation. That's the minimum school standards that we all have to abide by to be credited with being a public school. So they revised those that we needed to come up with our own set of competencies to award credit based on student mastery by 2008-2009. Phase 2, what about the accountability system? Well, in July 2012, New Hampshire DOE wrote a concept paper that wanted to make sure that there was an accountability system. However, the gap is between 2009 and 2012, high schools were working really hard to develop those competencies. But there wasn't a lot of guidance. And some schools did a really good job at it. Some schools were trying to ignore it, thinking this is going to go away. Some schools really embraced that philosophy and not only developed competencies for their high school credits, they also developed the competency-based model of education. And they're two very different things. Remember, up until 2008-2009, high schools were only required to have competencies for graduate to demonstrate mastery. But that doesn't mean that they had a competency-based model. And that is where that accountability system comes in. What about the other pieces? Where are the assessments? Where are the retakes? Where are the forms and those things? We're going to talk about that. So, but New Hampshire embraced it. They wanted to go further with this. So, in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, they applied for a waiver to the federal government. They submitted a request based on the state's current accountability system, which is the old age-graded model, but added a provision that they would begin to construct a new competency-based accountability system. Why is this important and why did I include it here? Because in 2012, New Hampshire told the federal government, we're going to this. We're going to a competency-based accountability system for all our schools. 2012, New Hampshire DOE began a large-scale professional development initiative with teams of New Hampshire educators from the first cohort of schools that were dedicated to implementing competency education. So, they designed a performance assessment model. Legislature passes legislation that supports competency-based education in 2013. In 2013, New Hampshire State Legislature passed Senate Bill 48, an act relative to school performance and accountability, which amended the statute on schools' performance and accountability. The legislation stressed the state's commitment to build a competency-based system where students are provided with personalized learning that provides flexibility in the way that credit can be earned and awarded. There's a lot to that phrase, because now we wanted to start looking at ways that students could demonstrate mastery. You ever hear of Fred Baramte? Fred Baramte was one of the huge pushers for this model. And he believed that if you could demonstrate a high school course, such as French or Spanish, maybe you had a French nanny or a Spanish nanny, or you go there in the summer, and you could demonstrate that you've had those proficiency outside of school, why wouldn't we still give them credit? Now here's why Fred Baramte was so powerful. Because for 12 years he sat on the New Hampshire School Board. He was the chair of the New Hampshire School Board. And he believed in this model and he helped push this model. In fact, he still has his own organization that he's privately owned that's still pushing this exact same thing. Same thing for sports teams. Well, why do we make every freshman take high school PE when we have world-class dancers and gymnastics and other equestrian events and other things that are happening outside of our schools that might demonstrate those exact same things? The legislation says schools can now start looking at flexible ways of earning and awarding that credit. So that's also why we want to develop competencies, because we want to give students more opportunities, not less opportunities. Not you have to sit through this course because it's given by our teachers and only in this building, only at this time. We want ability to start expanding what we can offer students. Online, college credits, outside of school. Can the schools start giving these credits to award for graduation? The answer is yes, we can start developing those things now. But they can advance when they demonstrate the desired level of mastery. So, where else? We started coordinating with the educators across the state, other assessment things. Oh, actually, so 2013, this is interesting. So a lot of schools started saying, okay, 2008, 2009, we developed our competencies. Now when we're looking at them again in 2013, most of the high schools in New Hampshire are actually revising them. They're looking at the competencies a second time, not just the first time. And they ask the state for help. They're like, look, give us more guidance and more support. We embrace this. So then the state said, okay, we're going to develop state-level competencies in mathematics, science, art, English language arts, and work study practices. And that started the basis for consistency in all schools in New Hampshire. New Hampshire schools are still local control, by the way. The local school board still has the authority to accept those competencies. The schools can change those competencies, but this was a basis to make sure that all the schools had guidance in what is a developed, well-written competency, what are we looking for, and giving schools a lot more supports, and what are those competencies, and do we have understanding around those. PACE schools. You probably have heard of PACE schools. And again, this is where the competency-based model in New Hampshire is tied to our federal government. We ask for a waiver. Schools have to take certain federal standardized tests to get our money, right? We have to make sure we do the right things, fill out the right paperwork, get our money. Well, in 2014, with some outside money, Nellie Mae and William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, New Hampshire DOE established a PACE pilot of 4 implementing districts. Basically, they're coming up with what might a fully developed and implementing an accountability system look like. These were Sanborn, Sauhegan, Epping, and I'm missing one, and it'll come up here in a second. So they asked the DOE, please give us some time. Can we let these schools explore this area and don't make them take as many of the standardized tests that you make all the other schools take? Federal government says yes. They said, okay. They said it was pretty innovative, the necessary step to advance, that's what we said. Then the waiver proposal, the state argues that the current system is likely an impediment from moving good to great. You get what that is? The New Hampshire government said, we got good schools, but if we really truly want to move our schools forward, we have to change our current model. And they put that in their application to the federal government. In the same proposal, New Hampshire DOE expressed their intent to move into an accountability model where localities have more agency to design their own systems. Do you see the growth of the competency-based model? First it was competencies, and then it was their belief in an accountability system based on competency-based model. So DOE says, yep, we will do that. We'll let you go run with the PACE pilot. And so it changed the requirements just for those 4 schools, districts, but it didn't change for the other New Hampshire districts. The pilot was the first of its kind in the nation, allowing districts to reduce the level of standardized testing in favor of more locally managed competency assessments that are more integrated into students' day-to-day work. The 4 districts that initially participated were Sanborn, Rochester, Epping, and Sauhegan. Oh, wait till you hear the next part. The federal government liked the PACE model. In fact, they've used the New Hampshire language, and the Assessment Accountability Demonstration Authority is modeled after the New Hampshire PACE initiative and now has extended the opportunity up to 7 states. New Hampshire is leading the way. And I know that's sometimes scary. You're like, oh, what do you mean? Yeah, have you heard of SNHU? Grew out of absolutely this little tiny nothing of a college and now is a huge school. Guess where their president is right now? He based that on being one of the first universities to base it on competency-based model. He believes adults can also benefit from competency-based model, and we can help get your degrees much faster. That's part of SNHU's huge growth
was its belief in competency-based education. And it grew and it grew and it grew. And he's in Washington, D.C. right now for 3 months on leave in one of their think tanks down there, by the way. So New Hampshire is leading the way. And we want to help students because, tie it back into our age-graded model. As much as we love our age-grade model and we understand our age-graded model, I hope you can agree it's not the best we can do. And New Hampshire feels it's not the best we can do. So, grades. Grades comes up often. So, PACE schools begin to question grades. The New Hampshire Learning Initiative won a grant in 2015 from Next Generation Learning Challenges for their NG2, Personalized Inclusive Education Pathways. And you can look that up online, by the way, and read the whole thing. Which aims to improve New Hampshire's personalized learning, which also dismantling the concept of grades. Grades you're going to have to look at in two ways here, too, by the way, and I'm going to talk about that. There's two forms of grades. There's the traditional rating system of A, B, C, D, which are used to often show or attempting to show what a student's learning may be, but there's flaws in those grades. Oftentimes things like, and I'll exaggerate here, but extra credit, and you participated in this, and you participated in that, and you have a participation grade. All those things dilute actually the validity of that grade in showing what the student learned. Every time you start adding in, hey, you get 20% just by being a good kid and showing up and raising your hand. You get 40% by turning in your homework. Homework that I'm not sure that you did on your own or really demonstrates your understanding. Next thing you know, that grade really is not reflective of the student learning. That's why you hear people talk about the summative. The summative is reflective of the grade in the learning. That is the shift in what grading is doing. Grading is trying to show what the students know and can do, and not just compliance. And that's where you see that shift in the grading philosophy. It wants to reflect what students can know and do. The other thing about grades is, and I've already talked about this, they want to look at what does it mean to be first, second, third, and fourth grade? Why do we group students still by age? Is that truly meeting the best needs of those students? If that kindergartner comes in, can read at a second grade level, well, why can't they just walk across the hall and during that reading time be with other students of that same reading ability? They can. We should be able to have flexibility in our students and where they go. And high school students taking college courses and eighth graders taking high school geometry. Those are things that we can expand upon in a competency-based model that we can't do in a traditional model that says, this is freshman algebra. Even the title says, this is only for freshmen. Well, how do we know all freshmen are ready for that algebra, or that they're not, or they might have been ready earlier? So they are questioning grades. New Hampshire PACE schools are starting to look at that. And oh, by the way, PACE has been extended to 7 additional school districts. So at this time, there's more than just 4 PACE districts. I don't know, they have the ability for 7 more districts to sign on to be PACE districts. I don't know if all 7 of those slots have been taken yet, but New Hampshire is expanding the PACE program as well. They did a study, and I didn't include it here, on the effectiveness of PACE schools, and they were by far outperforming their counterparts. That's why the New Hampshire school system wants to expand the PACE schools, because already the early results of even districts like Rochester that has a lot of poverty and other districts that are very different are showing that the actual education level of the students are going up much faster than the traditional model, and that's why they want to expand it. So I talked a lot about it already, but what are some of the pillars of competency-based education? Well, instead of focusing on time, we want to focus on the learner as an individual. We want to provide more opportunities for each individual to develop skills at their own pace, regardless of age, but of readiness. Collaborate with others, collect evidence of learning, and become successful lifelong learners. Some of the things that we have to do this. Well, you have to know what the competency is. What is the end result that we want them to get? Well, we're going to share that right at the beginning with our students. You need to master this to achieve the goal. We're going to help them progress through their learning process without all the time constraints. There's still going to be some time constraints, but hopefully students can excel faster And we'll have more and more students getting college credits at high school or even younger. We'll have more and more middle schoolers getting high school credit for world language or algebra or geometry. We want to not hold, our model holds some of our students back currently because we don't offer them those things. We want them to explore diverse learning opportunities. I already talked about how we're given the affordability to have some flexibility in what we can accept as high school credit now. We want students to explore more diverse learning opportunities. If they do an internship for a company, we might equate that to some sort of high school credit. We might be able to. That's where we're going to have some of that opportunity to do that. We want to collaborate in learning activities with communities of peers and mentors, create learning artifacts that represent their competencies, reflect on their own learning and achievements. You've probably seen student ownership as a key pillar. We want students to reflect on their summatives. What did I get right? What do I need to work on? How do I come up with a plan to say, hey, this is what I need to work on? That's why we talk about the retake protocols. That's why we give students multiple opportunities to retest. It's because we recognize not all students learn at the same pace. And the point is, we want to promote high quality work. And if that means doing it a second time, but you get high quality work, well then we let them do it a second time. But they have to take that ownership and they have to start doing that. And we can have students do that. And I've seen student ownership as early as kindergarten. Remember I talked about those sight words? Not every child is on the same page on the same day in the sight words that they know. Students at 5 years old can still recognize what sight words they know and what ones they still need to work on, and they can track their own progress. I've seen it in a kindergarten classroom, and the teacher used it as a math activity where the students are graphing the number of sight words that they know. So did they know what they needed to get to? Yeah, they knew what they needed to get to. The goal was set for them. Here's the 150 sight words you need to know. Where are you at now? The child could identify where they're at now, and they could identify what words they need to learn next. We can create that student ownership every step of the way. So when they get to college, they get to life, you know, they can do things on their own, and it's not just us marking up their tests saying this is what you did wrong. That is not as valuable. We need to teach them the skills of that student ownership. Sometimes you hear it as called an outcomes-based model, and that's the same thing. The outcomes are the competencies. The curriculum is designed to start with the learning outcomes rather than the time and term structures. Build high-quality, shareable resources, assessments, and rubrics. It is really hard. All the educators in the room understand this, but sometimes we don't as parents, and we forget when we went through school. Sometimes that freshman algebra class, I'll take that as an example, was very different depending on what teacher you had. This teacher graded one way. Homework was worth this, extra credit was worth this, tests were worth this. This teacher graded a different way. And so we had no consistency just a few years ago around those assessments and how those classes were taught. In fact, I would even go so far as say, this teacher really didn't like teaching polynomials or whatever it was. And then this teacher really loved teaching those things. And so the teacher at the next level would say, oh, you must have come from Mr. So-and-so's class because he doesn't like teaching that. So there's huge inconsistencies and gaps within our own teaching because teachers had that ability to do so. But when teachers start working together in their PLCs, that professional learning community, they start collaborating with other schools, they start creating some of these assessments that are common. Now when they give the same assessment to all their students and they sit in that group at a PLC, it's not just valuable for the student. Guess who else it's valuable for? Now it's valuable for the teacher. Oh, let's say you had 4 teachers teaching the same thing, and 3 of them did this concept really well, but this one teacher says, oh, my students didn't get this. What are you guys doing that I can learn from you to make sure my students are getting this? That can only happen when you have common assessments, that they're shared, and they're shared resources. The other thing about shared resources, and we're not here yet, but one of the things that we need to do is to develop these banks of resources that students can go to. When they have to do a retake and they didn't get a concept, we can point them in the right direction and say, here are the resources for this, for you. The teachers can share them together, and it takes a lot of the extra work off the individual teacher where they can share this workload. The rubrics help also come up with more consistency of what the students have mastered and what they have learned. Now, not as many of those gaps are happening. teachers are held accountable. Did you teach the whole curriculum the way that we all agreed that we're going to teach the curriculum? That wasn't happening before. That is happening now. So our assessments are also getting better. We're learning what quality assessments are. We're getting our teachers trained on those assessments. We're using higher order thinking. We're all going through that. All the schools in New Hampshire, you might have heard that oftentimes we had low-level 1 questions. And what is that? That's rote recall, dates, times, generals' names, things like that. Most of our assessments were based on those recall. And I went to college, I took a lot of European history, I had to memorize a lot of things, I filled out a lot of blue books, but I don't remember that stuff today. It's not an effective way of teaching. We need higher level order thinking where they can apply that knowledge, they can use it in more innovative ways, and that's where we're redesigning our assessments to make sure that they're designed that way as well. So, this is, here we go. The last one's the Great Schools Partnership labeled their 10 principles of competency-based education. Some of them we've talked about. All learning expectations are clearly and consistently communicated. Student achievement is evaluated against common learning standards and performance expectations. Again, I talked about that already. What are common expectations? All forms of assessments are standards-based and criterion referenced, and success is defined by the achievement of expected standards, not relative measures of performance or student-to-student comparisons. Formative assessments measure learning progress. You'll hear this term a lot in competency-based education. This is the journey along the way to the learning. We don't want to punish students or discourage students with the formative assessments. That's why oftentimes they're not graded. But just because they're not graded doesn't mean they didn't get the feedback on what they need to learn. So formative assessments are that measure along the way. Are they ready? What else do they need to do? How do we change our teaching? How do we change more supports or adjust for them? And then the summative assessments, that is what evaluates the learning. They look at the assessment results and then they determine whether they met that competency or not. Oh, and there is a good point there where it says specific point in time. Just because they scored so well on one summative doesn't necessarily mean that it's mastery. Sometimes they have to demonstrate that mastery multiple times, and that is to assure that they've actually mastered that. Academic progress and achievement are monitored and reported separately from work habits, character traits, and behaviors. I had this conversation just the other day, and I want to share it with you. It had to do with students cheating. The old way, we might say, okay, if a student's caught cheating, that's a 0 on the assessment. No way can they take it again. That is not right. They need to be punished. They shouldn't have the opportunity. They were caught cheating. Well, in a competency-based model, if we want the grade to be reflective of their learning and what they know, if all of a sudden I put in a 0 in that grade, does that grade really reflect the knowledge of that child? No, it doesn't reflect what the child knows. It reflects that the child got punished, maybe, for not doing what they're supposed to do. No one is saying that that child shouldn't learn that lesson, but it has to be reported separately. That's a conversation with the parents, it's detention, it's whatever, I don't know. There's lots of different things, but it shouldn't be impacted by the grade, because then the grade would be reflective of not their learning. It would be reflective of all those things that we tried to take out of that grade, the things that weren't reflective of that. So we have to think of other ways to make sure that we can report their character traits. We have a citizenship or work habits that we can report out separately that reflects our disappointment in what they chose to do, and make sure that that's reported out. But again, the academic grades communicate the learning progress. Students are given multiple opportunities. I've talked about that already in their work to meet to meet the expected standards. Is that such a bad thing, given multiple opportunities? If we say this is what we expect, but this is where you're at, the old model says, oh, okay, you got a D, you can move on. We're not teaching quality at all. We're teaching them that we have low expectations and that they can continually meet those low expectations. And that's not okay. We expect more of our students, and we say, you know what? Maybe you do need more time, or you need to work harder, or you need to do a number of different things, but this is still our expectation, and here are the supports. We're going to help you to get there. So we're teaching them higher expectations and making sure that we get there. The last one is to make important decisions. Students are given opportunities. Student voice is huge, and we need to get better at this. If you have a competency that you want a student to reach, yeah, it might be a project, but who are we to limit that project? Maybe it's a song, maybe it's a script, maybe it's something else. I taught German, by the way, and I started looking at this years and years and years ago, and if I wanted them to conjugate verbs or demonstrate vocabulary use, I can do this in a lot of different ways. You can have them write a song. You can have them write a script and take a video on iMovie. You can have them do lots of different things, and it shouldn't be limited by my limited imagination. We should give students multiple opportunities to have voice in what those assessments are, what those projects are, and how they're going to engage in that process and still demonstrate that same competency. You say, here's what you need to demonstrate. How might you demonstrate it? The old way, we said, here's your pencil and paper test, and that's the only way you can demonstrate that knowledge? No, let's start giving them more opportunities they can start contributing to the design of those learning experiences and start developing some of their own pathways. The last section, and then we'll open it up for questions. Well, how do we get there? Well, no two pathways are the same. It's individualized for us too. We're here today. We want to put in some of those structures that need to be put in place. We need this to be a collaborative process. I see people who are on my interview committee, and I see people who've heard me talk about this. I call it a triad. And you put in your student advisory council, where you get your student voice. You have your faculty advisory council, where you have your school voice, and you have a parent advisory council, where they put in their parent voice. And you talk about this. What should this model look like? Is it 4 tiers, 5 tiers? Should we use A, B, C, D? Should we use different letters? Should we do different things? That's the model I did in my previous district. Parents and students helped design what we rolled out. And that was much more effective in a lot of ways. They owned it, they understood it, they had voice in its creation. What else? You may have heard me talk about the Competency-Based Education Committee. This is going to be made up of parents, students, faculty, administration, school board members, and we're tasked to develop a multi-year plan to guide CB initiative. We don't want to go, this year we're going to do assessments, next year we're going to do this, and next year we're going to do this. We need a plan. We need a map to help guide us. Not to say that that won't diverge once in a while, but at least to help us get us there, we are going to help develop that guide as we move forward. Professional development. We've been doing a lot of this, and we haven't communicated a lot of that with you because it's been our teachers who have been doing that development. But we've had universal design for learning. We've had 2 different teams go through that at this point. That's some of the training paid for by the state. We're learning from all those previous cohorts. Quality performance assessments. That is also collaborative across the state with different schools. We have a high school team that's participating in that right now. Higher order thinking skills and questions. We've talked about that. Project-based learning, flexible grouping. These are all different things that we're getting professional development on to start implementing a much better competency-based model. And that's ongoing, and it will continue to move forward. We're also developing a strategic plan, which isn't just competency-based education. That's going to be a multi-year guide to initiatives. I just, at the very last board meeting, talked about how we're going to develop this plan. And for the next year and a half, we're going to be developing a strategic plan. And that's not just for competency-based education, but that's the large umbrella to start saying, how do we coordinate everything that's going on here? Whether that's a math initiative, whether that's competency-based instruction, whether that's some other standardized assessments, whatever that is, technology, whatever we identify as the priority areas, we're going to start developing a plan to make sure that they're all mapped together and are complementing each other and not being contradiction to each other. And that, I don't even know what time it is. 41 minutes. Not bad. There you go. Competency-based education primer. Questions? Yes?
So my major, I have no problem with competency-based learning. I agree with it. I like a lot of it. My daughter's a sophomore at the high school now, and she's being scaled or graded in a competency-based triad.
Okay.
On a program that isn't yet developed and implemented. So you have a great outlook on what you're going to do, but we're not there yet, but we're grading them as though we are.
We'll never be there unless we take the first step to get there.
And it has to start with the grading, or does it have to start with...
It does not have to start with the grading. It can start with other areas, and that's why you've seen a partial step back in the grading process. I think you've heard those conversations if you've been following them. That was not just your concern, that was others' concerns as well. No, there are other places that we can look at. Instruction, flexible grouping, our assessments. There are other areas that we're going to start seeing where we're going to focus on. And so the reality is that's why we're creating those committees. What are our priority areas? What do we want to tackle first? What do we want to tackle second? What is an acceptable timeline for implementation? And you're going to have a school voice, because there'll be teachers and administrators on that committee. There's going to be a parent voice, and your perspective is extremely valuable. My daughter comes home and says she doesn't understand this. Great, tell us why. What can we do? We're going to have student voice on that too. And so going forward, those are going to be part of those conversations that are exactly that. What's next, and how do we get there? Other questions? Yeah.
My son is also a sophomore at the high school, as her daughter is a sophomore. I guess the question I have is, as this is being implemented, when I talk to my son about his assignments and his grades, when I see him go online and look at his work, his mindset is still A, B, C, D, F. And he keeps telling me, don't look at the formative, Dad, look at the summative. Okay. And I'm like, okay, I'm looking at the summative, I see C. I'm looking at the formative, I see this, this, and this. So he explains it the way he knows it. Okay. So I guess my question is, how much time, because teachers are limited to a certain amount of time a day with the students, how much time is spent with in the classroom or in advisory? This is how it works and this is what we expect. Because every kid's going to interpret it their own way. And then he's going to come home and translate it to his parents. Right. And every time he tells me not to look at something, I'm like, no, I'm looking at that. They're telling me not to look at it.
As every good dad would.
Right. Yeah. And we just had this conversation tonight before the meeting because he has midterms and grades coming up. And he's like, Dad, I know that my science is a C, but after the midterm and after my test Friday, it'll definitely be a B. Okay. But I'm looking at the formative. And he's like, don't worry about that. I'm like, oh, well, I'm worried about that because from your presentation, he hasn't mastered what he can, or to the best of his ability, the ways to get to that end grade. How much of the students being informed that the formative is just as important as the rest of it?
Yeah, so I can't answer all the school specific and especially teacher specific, and you're absolutely right. We all had different teachers who spent different amount of time telling us about their grading practices, and some students really understand it and some don't. So I really don't have all the answers around each individual teacher at the high school and how much time they spent on educating the students. But we do know that we're talking to our students in the Student Advisory Council and talking to them and saying, look, do you have questions? Are they bringing up questions? Are they not bringing up questions? Is this isolated to your son and not others? Those are things that we definitely want to look at and make sure that they understand the process too. The reality is, students have always had questions about grading, and they've always gone up to their teacher at the end of the term. When I was an 8th grade teacher, one of the most frustrating things ever is when you did all this grading. You graded on Sunday nights, you handed back all this grading, you handed it back to them, right? End of the quarter, they come up and they ask that dreaded question, how am I doing? How am I doing? Why do I bother handing you all back this stuff that I spent all this time grading and took the points off here and there, right? These questions have been existing forever. It's not just this model. But that is a good example of maybe the old model wasn't great at communicating to the child what they need to learn or how they're doing, and that was a good example of why we needed to change to create that student ownership. I'm so excited in the example you gave that he's trying to explain it to you, and he's looking at it, and he's taking ownership of it, and I'd guess I'd trust him for a little bit and see if that C does turn into a B as he thinks it's going to, and say, good job, you did exactly what you're supposed to do, I'm proud of you, you got a B, or if it stays a C or gets lower, then start asking a lot of questions of him and his teachers and say, well, he didn't quite understand this. And that's what I would follow up with if that's what happens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So my kids are in kindergarten, so maybe I'm a little bit ahead of the game here. But my worry or my question is around national integration. So to be the pioneer is fine, change is fine. But if I decide to move to North Carolina and I have this competency model, how do we figure out in the new school that doesn't do this where he goes? Or, you know, obviously it's not an issue, but in 10 years he wants to go to Yale, or 15 years he wants to go to Yale, and they say, well, what were his grades? And I say, I don't know, he doesn't have grades. How is this going to integrate?
Well, so I can talk a little bit about the college question. There's a lot of myths around college, and people think that competency-based education is actually detrimental to getting into college, and the reality is it's not detrimental. In fact, it's usually looked at more favorably. In my previous district, we had several deans of admission come, one from UNH, one from, where was it, BU, and one from New England College. And they came and spoke to the audience, and guess what the first thing every dean of admissions does with grades? They throw them out. The reality is they throw them out. And I'm not making this up, they throw them out. Because there's no way to compare Exeter's 6.5 scale to Bedford's 5-point scale to someone else's 4-point scale. That's just within New Hampshire, by the way. They have all these different ways of calculating GPA. Some people do it out to the thousandths place, some people do it out to the 10,000ths place. So guess what every major university does? They throw them out and they recalculate them based on the names of the courses and what they feel those courses should be weighting. And that's how they can compare students from other states, other schools within the state, how they can compare students that are homeschooled without any GPA, how they can compare international students who don't have GPA. So we put a lot of emphasis on grades in a lot of the wrong areas. So colleges, my own children, 5, 7, and 9. I wouldn't want them to go through any other model than a competency-based model. I feel that as an educator, it's the right thing to do, and as a parent, I feel it's the right thing to do for students to improve their learning, to actually move them to where they are more capable of going. Is it perfect? No. I haven't seen a perfect education model, but I would love for the day that that kindergartner comes in and we start pairing them up with first graders because that's where they belong, not by the age, but because of their ability. And maybe just for one period a day. And maybe the other groups, maybe we have third graders in with fourth graders or fourth graders, it doesn't matter. Kids do this all the time on the playground, elsewhere. The only people who have issues with it typically are the adults, by the way. When I started teaching my children to ice skate, guess what class they were in? All three were in the same class. It didn't bother them. They had children of all different ages in that same class. They didn't feel any stigma about it whatsoever. This is my ability to skate right now. When I learn this skill, I get to go to this next level. We do it all the time, and we should do it with our students too. But to go back to answer your question, I don't think it's going to be detrimental for colleges whatsoever. To get into colleges, they accept international students, homeschool students. They want students of diverse backgrounds, and that comes without having GPAs or having GPAs that are recalculated. Kindergarten and going to another school, I would be proud to say, well, make them do their own assessments of them. Bring the assessments with them and say, what are you going to do for my child? And that's where you have to be an advocate for your child no matter where you go with that child. It happens already now. Some schools offer high school credits in middle school, and you get that child come to the high school. We have to review their transcript and say, well, we don't offer that, and you do offer that. We have to do this each and every day. Schools have to take into account where the child came from and what they had and what they haven't, and what can we do with the current model that they have. So you do the best you can. There's no perfect answer. Sorry. Yes?
I don't think we have much of a problem about the program and how it works. The problem lies with the rollout. There was a switch that happened this year. The students weren't ready, parents weren't ready. I don't think the teachers were faculty or there's been several instances with my child that the competencies were one question, you fail that one question, you fail the competency. Or if a sentence in other competency wasn't wasn't structured properly in a math class, you failed that competency. So it wasn't really a good understanding of what was going on in the class. It was more English and math at that point in time, than as far as beginning and ending of sentences. I think that the rollout should have started probably in the middle school and rolled up so kids could grow into this. But starting it into high school with the switch being, that's where the problem is. The way I look at it is, we're back in 2013 here, according to your presentation, and where Pelham is, and understanding where this is all. You listen to what Mr. Leather said, this was a transition. You transitioned into this thing, not a switch being.
Yeah, I think you called it transformation, but you're absolutely right. It is a transformation.
Right, and it takes years.
It does take years.
And doing it in high school from 9 to 12, that's very difficult to do, I think. I think it should have been done, or should be considered to be done in the
What grade is your child in?
10.
10. This has been going on for years. Whether that was communicated or not, I don't know, but it has been going on for years. So I do have, I think you have a lot of valid points, and I think implementation is very, very important. And how we do that, how we communicate, how we collaborate in that. I've said it from the day I was hired in this position that I'm a collaborative leader, and that is my style, and I gave dozens of examples of how that is. And that's why we're putting those structures in place. What might seem like a switch to you might not be a switch to everyone else. So the teachers who've been designing this and looking at this for years, we talked about the history, 2009, but your high school student just got here last year. For you, it does seem brand new. It is brand new for that child coming in, and it may be the first time you've seen it. So I can understand your perspective, and hey, this is brand new. Well, it might be brand new to you, but it doesn't mean it's brand new to everyone. And
Is it new to the school?
It was not new to the school.
So 10th, 9th, 10th, the high school was using competency for how many years before?
They weren't using the grade.
I don't know all the specifics, but I can tell you the competency-based transition or transformation, as you talked about, has been going on for years. Years. It is not just this year that was sprung on anyone. Some of the things, one of the points you made was new this year, and that was if you fail a competency, you fail the course. That was one of the attempts to move towards a competency-based model in the hopes that we raise that expectation. Before, if I got A, F on those three competencies, you could average out and move on. And that is more of the old model of we're building upon those gaps. I, as the educator, group of educators, identify these competencies are crucial and essential for your understanding of this material in this course. We're then saying, on the old model, you can get 2/3 of it and still move on. You may need that other 1/3 you didn't get, but I'm not quite sure. Let's see. And then they're already set up for a deficit in their next level class because they're missing that 1/3. So the philosophy behind it is we want to make sure that you get the foundation and the expectations are met at all levels to not set you up for that failure when you move forward. Because the studies are very clear. Guess who gets Fs? The person who got 1 F, it's a small group of students that get more Fs and more Fs and more Fs. And we can blame the student all we want, but also we have to look at the model. Are we setting them up for failure where we're saying, you didn't get it, we moved you on. You didn't get it, we moved you on. So raising the expectation, it's important stuff. But I agree that it might not have been communicated well enough, and they did roll that back this year at the board meetings. We talked about it. We had lots of conversations and say, we will roll that back, and we will go back to you can get an A, an F, and you still move on. Doesn't mean philosophically it's the right thing to do. But was it communicated, and is it fair if we don't set those expectations and communicate those expectations and then hold people to those expectations? No. That's why we have those conversations and we say, Okay, you're right. You're very valid. Maybe it wasn't communicated, but it doesn't mean it wasn't the right move towards that. I've used this example before. A pilot, right? He got landings really well, navigation's really well, but the takeoff, not so good. Well, that's great if you're already in the air and you're flying, and they averaged out, they passed flight school. I'd rather make sure that they passed all the competencies along the way and not just average them out. And so I hope you understand why we do feel it's important that they meet all the levels of competencies, but I also hope you understand why maybe that expectation wasn't communicated well enough, and that's why it was rolled back. But it is still very important that we have that high expectation and that they meet all those expectations going forward.
Hi. So I've been following along all the way through, and I have 2 10th graders and I have an 8th grader, and we've been in Pelham since they were in 4th grade. And so I'm just wondering if you can just talk about where is that competency-based education? What does it look like at the elementary? What have they been doing? What does it look like at the middle school? You say we've been doing this, but to be honest, this is the first year I've really heard about it. And it came with grades. And that is a shock to families. Like, we haven't heard, and I know you haven't been here long, but can you give me examples of where competency-based education is happening in our elementary, it's happening in our middle school?
I can't give you all the specifics, but I can give you this. Some of the history isn't just labeled competency-based education. Take your standards-based education that the elementary school has gone through. That's a precursor to competency-based education. That's saying, here's the standards we want you to get, and that is what's been reported at the elementary school for a number of years now. Those are examples of us moving forward that system. Instead of using traditional grades at the elementary level, moving more towards reporting out on the standards. Like in kindergarten, if let's say one of the standards is we want you to have all 26 letters of the alphabet known, you might have on a report card the 26 letters and 1 or 2 shaded in that they don't know. That's reporting on standards. Here's the standard, they need to know all this, but here's where your child is at. That is moving us towards that. So those are examples that are being done right now at the elementary level, all the way.
Still graded.
They
Still give it 11 grade.
well, but that's part of that transition, and it doesn't necessarily need to be there. But some of those things, we do a lot of assessments at the elementary level as well to understand where those reading groups are, and then within the classroom, they're doing flexible grouping of those students, and then as we get further along in it. I don't know about the elementary level as much, but I'll ask the principal, are we integrating between teams of students when we give those assessments on redoing those groups of students? Those would all be instructional practices that are part of competency-based model. Yeah. Someone new first, I think I saw another hand. And then, if not, absolutely. Yes?
I'm curious how you communicate to the students what mastery would be for these competencies, and I'll give you an example. When they were at the elementary school, and I think a lot of you would agree, whenever they had a project, we saw a matrix that said, this is mastery, this is working towards, this is beginning, or you didn't get it, or this is A, B, C, D. I personally am happy with the high school. I don't want to make it sound like I'm not. But at the middle school, we saw those matrices also. Here, I've mostly seen checklists. This is what needs to be on your project. I haven't seen a whole lot about how it's communicated to the students, what they need to do, and what they need to have within that project to be declared mastery.
Okay.
I personally am big on rubrics. I think they're important. But I haven't seen a whole lot, and if they're not doing rubrics that explain what these students need to demonstrate in order to achieve that mastery rating, I think it's something that we need to explore.
So I agree, and I see tons of head nodding behind you, by the way, the teacher contingency over there, and I'm not going to put any of them on the spot, but the reality is you're absolutely right, and that is why I would love for someone like you to be involved in the parent advisory committee here at the high school level, where you can communicate that to the high school teachers, to the administration there, and say, look, this is what I'm seeing, and this is what I'm not seeing. Or you have an example, this is what I saw here, and this is great. Can we have more of this? That's where your voice is very important for this process to make sure we can continue to make it better and continue to improve it.
See the students feeling more success, and it would allow them to take more ownership if within those project assignments we saw this is what it means to master. This is what we have to see in order to declare that you've mastered this. And I have to say, like, even as a parent helping my child interpret projects, it's been difficult because I'm used to looking at rubrics.
That's a great way to get involved, right? You know what their expectation is.
And I'm sitting there and I'm going, I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And I want to make it very clear, I'm not being critical of the high school. We're very happy with the high school. But I do think that that's something that should be explored because I think it would help everyone involved to be able to understand that that's what needs to be seen.
Well, thank you. And a large group heard you. Oh, they actually want to volunteer. I did not want to make this about school specific, but since they're volunteering and I'm not putting them on the spot, I would gladly turn it over to let one of them answer your question.
I teach high school English here. I have 2 kids in high school, 1 in middle school, and I've had 3 that have graduated from Pelham High School, so I've seen all the years here. I can speak for the English department and many other teachers that I've talked to. We wholeheartedly agree with you. We love rubrics. In our last 3 PLCs in English, we created a united competency recovery handout for students that are the same no matter what English class you have here at Pelham. They will be given the same instructions of what they're going to do with what they need to recover. We have right now a unified scoring guide, but we love rubrics. It's one of those transformations that's right now happening. I can see Pelham High School and throughout the whole school, every department having rubrics. It's just going to take a little bit of time to build it up.
It absolutely takes time. It's definitely a process. Yeah. I just figured that I should probably mention that I haven't seen a whole lot. And that doesn't mean I've never seen them. It just means I haven't seen a whole lot.
There is a need. And with the transition, our first thought this year with the transition was, oh, we've got to update our rubrics now to competency-based. So there's a lot of that, and it's happening slowly. It's slowly happening, but it is happening. And I'm watching it roll out. And I know, I'm sure my English department would let me say, we're very excited with what we're creating. We understand though it's like a first year type thing, and we're going to be making a lot of changes as we progress on. But I too, my 8th grader comes home with her rubric. She goes, this is what I need, Mom. I can look. And I'm like, all right, follow it, exactly. And I know as a teacher, I love it when I have one and I can hand my students. I have students that literally will ask me, Mrs. Day, where's the rubric? And I'm like, I'm working on it next class. I promise I'll have it for you. But there are many students that do ask for it. And but I encourage you, like Mr. Furbush did, join the parent committee, help us out.
I would enjoy that.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. You wanted to comment as well? Yeah.
I wanted to just give a little bit of history, just because I'm at that age where I can give a lot of history. In the district right now. We started, the rollout of standards-based report cards started in the 1st grade. And it went each year, that specific group of students was the first group that worked with every different group of teachers with that. So these kids who are now in the 8th grade, Mrs. Rapucci can attest to this because those were almost like our test kids who every year had to bring a new group of teachers along to the standards-based grading part of it. So that's where the standard-based has been. So that was, do you remember the year she was in 1st grade? At that point, I was teaching, I taught first grade when the first group of standard-based kids went there. I got moved to fourth grade when those same kids got to fourth grade, so I was able to help transition some of the teachers. And then as to competency-based, my son graduated in 2014, and he started with the traditional model, and as he got every single year, they were transitioning to competency-based. By the time he graduated 2014, all of his courses were in that competency-based area. So that's just a little bit of some of the history.
No, I appreciate it. As already pointed out, you know, I don't have a lot of the history, so thank you for sharing that. Other questions? Yes?
Question, just around flexible grouping, like I get how it, so I work at the elementary level, and I understand how we do it at the elementary level, but at the high school level, would it be within that course?
Maybe, but flexible grouping can look very different both inside and outside the classroom. There's teachers who flexibly group within the classroom for grouping of students and individual needs and what that might look like, whether they're independent work today or small group work or guided work with the teacher. So that's one way of flexibly grouping students. Then there's other ways of flexibly grouping students, as we talked about, like if you had all of fourth grade teaching reading at the same time, those teachers could work together on the common assessments and make sure that they target what those needs are of those students, and they could flexibly group within a grade level. Or, ideally, you could have large groups of a building, kindergarten, first, second, third, all teaching reading at the same time and flexibly grouping within ages, depending on the child.
Younger kids, it's the older kids.
The older kids, they more self-select in a lot of ways. We have students that do VLACs. They might choose to do that course instead. Flexible grouping is not as common at the high school level. It is not as common model at the high school level because we still typically have already, that still exists, you have courses that are weighted and leveled, so they're already self-selecting in a lot of ways to be in those groups. So it's not the same model.
Yeah, okay, that was my question.
Yeah. Yes?
You shared earlier, there's a lot of schools that have already successfully implemented this pretty fully and doing very well within New Hampshire.
Sanborn Regional is one that a lot of people have looked towards a lot. Brian Stack and John Vanderels were two of the principals in that district. John Vanderels was at the elementary level at the Backey School, and Brian Stack is at the high school. They've actually written a book, and they do a lot of the training in New Hampshire on their own, and so they go around. So Sanborn Regional is looked at often as one of the schools that have led the way, but there's no such place that doesn't have it without their own growing pains. Change is hard, and for some it's too fast, for some it's not fast enough, and for some it's too foreign, and so, but they're looked at often as one of the schools that have led the way. Sauhegan and Pittsfield School for the elementary level is looked at oftentimes as one of the schools that has been very innovative with a lot of the work that they've done. So there are different schools that have taken on a faster pace rollout than others. Yeah.
Does New Hampshire have any type of an initiative for Pelham to work with some of those schools to understand
There isn't a district initiative, but we're very fortunate that we visit these schools. We have our curriculum assessment coordinator meets with different curriculum coordinators, and we exchange ideas that way. We can visit schools all the time. Every school is always welcoming of school visits, and we've done school visits of different schools. And so New Hampshire is very welcoming, and most people know each other personally because we're such a small state in a lot of ways through different ways, so we can. And that is where we get some of those ideas. In fact, that's where when we start talking about our parent group and our student groups, we'll start getting some of those suggestions. And I love field trips. Let's go visit some of these other schools and start looking at what they're doing and then make the decision what's best for us. The beauty about this is, and the scary thing about this is, there's no one right answer. And every district has done it differently. There's not one magic way to roll this out. And every school district has done it differently. And that's actually one of the best things, though. What are our needs here, and what do we need for our students? And so we can look different. And so it's both scary but it's also refreshing that it can look different. Yes?
So I appreciated your presentation. I think I learned a few things from it.
Oh, good, thank you.
With all of my, I still am holding back on some of the stuff that I'm disappointed about with the grading and the rollout of the grading process. But trying to look at what that would look like, the competency-based model at the high school level with students within, say, a level 1 English class, and some kids are competent, they've met all, they're competent in all 3 areas, and then you have, you know, a group of kids who are not yet competent, and having enough resources to be able to bring these kids that are not yet competent up to your competent students and being able to move these kids forward. Like, you're still teaching these kids, but you have all of these kids. How are you doing that within, say, like the same level 1 class where kids are technically homogeneously grouped within that level, right? Mm-hmm. When they're going in. So I'm having a hard time working. I've worked in a high school, I've taught in a high school, and I'm having a hard time picturing what that would look like. Yeah. At an elementary level, I can picture it. I can't picture it at the high school level.
So you have to look at it very differently. In fact, some of the current models, you're looking at what might this look like keeping the exact same constraints that we already have. And so that's limiting our thinking. So if we homogeneously group all those students and half of them get it and half of them don't, the traditional thing is, well, what is the teacher to do? That's very limiting in our thinking. We have to look at, well, what are we using for technology? We have math programs now that can really assist students and to guide them where they're at. And they may be in very different places. And the teacher isn't more the sage on the stage disseminating the information, but going around assisting students in where they're at. And so you could have 27 students in 27 different places in that freshman algebra class or in that English class, and the teacher is actually working on these concepts. They might give a brief explanation of what it is that they're working on, the concept they want students to understand, and then they take a brief assessment, and then from that assessment the teacher gets immediate feedback on where all the students are at. And we have a lot of technology that starts assisting students. I've seen it at the elementary level, I've seen it at the high school level, where they start going and looking at, okay, what are your needs? And so that is some of the things that we can do. It's not just about the teacher bringing them up, and using your example, but it's also about the student ownership of the learning. We have to start motivating our students about the learning, and that starts at much younger ages. We've trained them to wait for the teacher to direct them what to do. We have to stop doing that. We have to start saying, where's your passion? What are you curious about? And how do we make sure that you're following that passion and meeting these competencies that help guide you along the way? So I guess I want to challenge your thinking and stop thinking about the old model and how we're going to make that old model work. And maybe we don't use the old model and keep trying to make a square peg fit in a round hole. We cut a new hole.
I chair special ed meetings and write IEPs, and I tell my parents all the time that our schools are not designed for kids with ADHD, kids that have to sit in their seat all day.
You're absolutely right. Why are we doing standing desk and the bars in the bottom? And why do we promote chewing gum now when years ago we told kids not to chew gum? Because we're changing the way we look at those things, and this is actually beneficial for our students.
Yeah, I agree with all of it. I just don't agree with how the grading was rolled out. I mean, that's just my...
That voice was very clear, and thank you for sharing every time.
I just want to add, like, everything sounds great. You sound like you have a good vision and a picture in your head. I just hope, like, from what we see as parents in coming home to us, we're not getting that. And I just want you to be realistic and know where Pelham is at and where we have to go to get there. I think ideally you sound great, and it sounds like a great vision. I'm all in for it. But I don't think we're there. I know we're not.
We're not there.
And there's a lot of changes that have to happen. And I just hope that you're realistic, you're visiting classrooms, you're checking in with teachers, there's accountability here. Because we're not there yet. I can tell you as a parent, we're not there yet. From what I see from my children coming home. I think we have a little bit more to go, And I think it's a great start, but I didn't like the rollout of the grades. It was a shocker. It was a surprise. But I think you know that. I think you know the consensus.
I tease you because I enjoy your conversations. You're right. We do have to work on a lot of things, and not just a little bit. We have a long way to go. However, we have to start somewhere. Yes. And guess where we're starting? We're starting where we're at. That's the only way you can do it. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do you climb a mountain? One step at a time. And that's what we're going to do, and we're going to keep going. And we're going to put those structures in place so we don't have any more of those miscommunications and missteps, that we're in this together and that we do understand it and that vision is shared and understood. I like to say the phrase, it's an evolution, not a revolution. A revolutions never last. As soon as that person leaves, all of a sudden it goes back to the way it was. It's an evolution and it takes time. And you're going to see these small incremental changes. Like we just heard about more rubrics at the high school, and we had a very enthusiastic Miss Day respond, and yes, we're going to do that. And so we're in this together. We are going to do this, and we're going to...
Yeah, and be aware of the supports that the teachers need to pull this off. God bless them. You know, like
Thank you.
We've changed the job description on the teacher without asking them. And
exactly.
So do they want this job? I mean, they can, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of performance management and performance, I don't even know how to...
I can feel the warmth of the appreciation from the teachers coming over there. Thank you for sharing that with them. We're almost out of time. A couple more questions. Any more questions? Yes?
This has been fun to listen to tonight, so thank you for being here and for taking the time for that. It would seem to me, listening to the comments, that I guess this year really was a formative for the competency-based. And I think the vision speaks very well to the future of our kids. But when do you think, as best you can tell, for the three constituents, for the parents, for the students, and for the teachers, that we would be at a summative phase for competency-based education?
Several years away. In fact, I wouldn't even begin to guess at this point. Until we get that committee together, until we start hearing more of these voices of people where they're at, and until we start designing that multi-year plan, until we have that, I wouldn't guess at this point, but it is several years away. But it doesn't mean we're not moving forward and making things better. One of the phrases that I cringe at whenever I hear it is, these students are the guinea pigs and these students are the test subjects. When you walk into those classrooms, those are the same quality teachers that were there last year. They're the same quality teachers that are caring for your students, that are talking to your students, that are educating your students. Whether the model has changed slightly or not, they're not guinea pigs. They're not being poked and prodded. They're not being put at jeopardy for their learning. That same high quality education is still going on. It may look different. That assessment may be broken out into 3 different areas instead of just here's 25 questions that we mark right or wrong. It's an improvement into the right direction. And so just like when we get new cars, doesn't mean all the old cars were wrong or bad. They were what they were at that time, and they get better. And we're getting better, and we're improving as we go along. We learn formatively from things that we do. And so no one is being a guinea pig or tested and sacrificed for the next generation. That's not what's happening. We are improving as we go along, and we're learning, and the same quality education is still happening, and we're learning from that to make it better. Yes? Oh, do I have to call on you?
So the video you showed, right, with the snapshot, the document that I highlighted, that you start at the high school, that you have more challenges than starting at a different grade level. So help me understand why New Hampshire potentially historically started at the high school level when they rolled out this initiative, if you have that insight.
I don't have that insight, but you're absolutely right. It started at the high school level with New Hampshire legislation saying all high schools will develop these competencies and we're going to get rid of the Carnegie unit. That was the start of this whole thing. Absolutely correct. But I guess even New Hampshire learns from it and says, okay, we learned that we needed more supports. We needed more, make this a K-12 model to move forward through it. And I guess they learned from their own feedback too as they rolled this out. But that's where it started. You're right.
Part 2.
Okay.
So you mentioned that there are a lot of high schools that have rolled this out.
what part of it did they roll out first, or should they have rolled out first based on hindsight? Was
So-
it the assessments, was it the professional development, like which part of it had the highest level of success?
So there is a report, and I don't know the name of that report right now off the top of my head, but I'll get it for you and we can do that. They researched the 4 communities of Epping, Rochester, Sauhegan, and now Sanborn. And they looked at those 4 reports, and it came out very favorably of what they were doing, and that's where they expanded that along the way. But having insight into some of those districts, every one of them did it differently. Every one of their models is slightly different in how they do it. I've personally have visited Epping and Sanborn and Rochester, and I've spoken to their leadership there and know their leadership there, and every one of them has done it differently. And so honestly, to pinpoint it, I can't say do the assessments first, do this, but I will say that teacher support is very important. Teacher buy-in is extremely important. We have to educate our staff, and they have to buy into it, and they have to believe in it, because they're the ones selling it to the students, they're the ones selling it to the parents, and they're the ones doing the work, the heavy lifting of the assessment. So honestly, that's where I always want to start, is with the teachers and making sure that they have the understanding and the supports that they need. Then I like to look at the assessments. I think we have an understanding of what quality assessments, high-level achievement assessments look like, and I think we need to start with those too. After that, so that's the 2-pronged approach that I would think would be very, very effective. But there's no right or wrong answer. But that's where, personally, I would go. All right. Yes.
I'll make it quick. I'm sorry.
I love your enthusiasm.
Okay. I had the privilege of going to a professional development day, and one of the workshops I went to was from Sanborn, talking about competency-based. And I was super excited to hear and learn some of the things that I picked up that day. He had like a chart of all the different aspects of competency-based education.
Was it Brian Stack?
I don't have my notes.
I bet you. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. And he said it does not matter where you begin. What matters is that you begin and you don't stop. He said it took them a good 8 years to get everything aligned and set. And he said when you take one aspect of competency-based education, it touches all the other aspects. So, and we've touched upon that tonight. The summatives, the rubrics, the timing, the recovery, I mean everything. There's not one aspect of education that competency-based education does not touch. So it's a matter of starting somewhere and then not stopping, but moving forward. And he said it's worth it. His example was the year before they started, they had teachers slamming doors and cursing each other in the hallway, more behavioral problems with students than they've ever had, highest rate of dropout, and they started it. And he said, in this eighth year now, teachers don't have duties, kids are actively engaged in their own education, they have their own student body that other students can choose to be disciplined through if they don't want to take what's written in the handbook. I mean, there's all aspects that have been touched upon it. And I thought, okay, what do I take away from this? Doesn't matter where we start. And when we start, we got to keep going. We might need to pull back a little. Maybe we got ahead of ourselves here a little. But we started it, and we, at least as teachers, we're here because we care about the students. So we're going to do all we can to do our best to explain to them in a way that they'll understand what's happening and that they can do their best to get their highest level of achievement.
It would be interesting to know when the grading came in that 8 years.
I will say that my 7th grader has had different grading. She's my youngest of 6 kids, different grading than all my other kids have had, all through her school. So when you said it started there with 8th grade, that's when I, as a mother, saw the biggest change with my 7th grader. There's been some other little changes, like in high school. Biggest change I've seen in everything's my 7th grade. Yeah. other than like schedule changes and timing of things, stuff like that. The biggest is finances. But I have vested interest in this as a parent myself. So I want to make sure my junior, you know, that he gets accepted into his college. So I vested as a mom as a teacher. But I get very excited about it. I was in Londonderry. Last year was their first year. And like Mr. Furbush said, completely different than South Sanborn does it. But there, kids decided like, it's different with every class. I was in an English class. And I saw students moving on their own level. Some were further ahead, some were slower. As long as they meet their deadline and what they have to do, they got to move on their own. And it was so exciting to see that. So exciting.
Nice. All right. Paul, last comment, and then we'll call it good. So end us on a great note.
Positive. I've had most of your children in my classroom, and I can say you're very involved parents, and your kids do a great job. And I know it's probably hard to see in the competency zone where maybe they weren't doing as well as you thought. But on the other hand, all the parents that aren't here for those kids that live in the D-Ville, those kids are seeing A's for the first time. And it really means something to them, and it's boosting their egos, and it's making them want to work more. So there is, with all the negative, I'm seeing some positive, and it makes me feel good as an educator.
Perfect. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you so much.